What it do, people? I was gonna do a overview or a recap of the causes of Southern secession. I know this was probably the most complicated uh, topic with the most moving parts. So I was gonna go through each of these a little bit so you can see them again. The other thing I would just highly suggest, if this is still a little floozy in your head, is that you check out Crash Course U.S. History. You watch that. You can watch it on 0.75 speed. You can watch it on 1.25 speed if it's not quite your, up to how fast your brain is moving, and that can give you more information. So anyway, I'm gonna start really quick. What we started with. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how I can actually show this. Yeah, whatever. Okay. Anyway, so not in present mode. Actually, this does it. Perfect. So the first thing we did is we talked a little bit about our sectionalism Congress activity and how that kind of changed or influenced people's decisions and what developed some tension. So there's issues with obviously the expansion of slavery, talking about slavery on the Senate floor, um, whether or not African Americans were going to be considered citizens if they crossed into free territory, how new territories would be incorporated, whether they would be slave or free, especially after the Mexican American War, and also this um, conflict over how the economy should be developed. So the North really wants to do a lot of investment at the federal level into internal improvements like roads and bridges and canals, whereas the South is more of an agrarian agricultural economy. So we had kind of had all those examples play out in our simulation. So I'm going to run through the major events. There were six of them that we really focused on. Where is my pen? What is this? Dang it. Okay. Whoops. Anywho, so the Compromise of 1850, the backdrop of this is the Mexican Secession. So after the Mexican American War, the question is, are those new states in the Southwest that aren't regulated by the Missouri Compromise, are they going to be slave or free? Because remember, the Missouri Compromise says that any of the current territories in the United States that are below or south of Missouri are going to, which is like 3630 in terms of latitude, longitude, are going to be slave, and anything north of that are going to be free. However, the country did not include all that territory that America got from Mexico at that time. So now all bets are off. They have to make some decisions. So they ended up getting out a deal between Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas that the Texas part isn't as important, but California becomes a free state. That's something that the North gets. New Mexico and Utah territories would decide based on popular sovereignty. Remember, popular sovereignty is related to the people deciding if they're going to voting and deciding if they're going to be slave or free. And then that's something that it kind of helps the South a little bit more because they kind of figure that those territories are going to go slave, but it doesn't really like point to slavery directly. So it's kind of a toss up between the two. The South gets a new fugitive slave law that strengthens the old one, but now kind of forces people in the North to aid in the capture of runaway slaves. And they were punished if they aid runaways. So that was kind of angered a lot of northern abolitionists, people that want to get rid of slavery, quite a bit. The slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., but slavery was still okay. So, again, we've got something for the North, something kind of for the South in a way, something definitely for the South, and something for the North. The effects was it postponed the Civil War for 10 years, but basically everybody got something that they liked, but also something that they really didn't like. So it still polarized the North and the South and made them more divided based on their original points of view. So flash forward a couple of years, and Stephen Douglas. There's a picture of him right there. They just call him the Little Giant, but he's like 5'4" or something like that. But he really, really, really wanted to get a railroad built in through Chicago. In order to do that, they had to organize the territory in Kansas and Nebraska. But the only way he was going to get enough votes in the southern part of his party was to kind of do something to help the pro-slavery people. So that's kind of the backdrop. It's kind of complicated politically, but it's really just to do something to help the pro-slavery Southerners in the Democratic Party pass this bill that was going to get this railroad built. But the repercussions are what's more important. So the deal was Kansas and Nebraska would actually decide that they would be free or slave based on popular sovereignty. Once again, they would vote. And this is key because this territory was governed by the Missouri Compromise. So technically, it shouldn't be decided based on a vote. It should be decided based on the Missouri Compromise. But they passed this act and they undid the Missouri Compromise, and now all bets are off pretty much anywhere. And Kansas, Nebraska would vote on whether they would be slave or free. The effects of this are that anti slavery forces in the North really hated the bill. They felt betrayed. The Republican Party ends up forming, and then you have this time period called Bleeding Kansas, where you had a whole bunch of anti-slavery Northerners and a bunch of pro-slavery Southerners moving into Canada, trying to influence the election, voting illegally, and then there would often be violence. So a lot of actual physical violence between people in America. People often call this the beginning or like the first quote-unquote battle of the Civil War. And there's a video clip that kind of explains what's happening in a lot more depth than what you need. I use it for my IB kids, but you can check that out at your leisure. Gosh, I used to have a thing that showed me how much time I was taking. Anyway, 3 years after that, you had the Dred Scott. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead because in 1854, you also had the birth of the Republican Party, which kind of comes out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So they formed in Ripon, Wisconsin. They were kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of different political parties. They were against the Southern Democrats. There were Northern Democrats as well, but definitely against the Southern Democrats. But their big strategy that you need to know is they want to keep slavery where it is, not allow the expansion of slavery, not abolish slavery. They weren't what's called abolitionist, but they wanted to keep slavery where it was. So then I'll go back 3 years later in 1857. You had this guy, Dred Scott. He was a slave whose master had taken him into free territory in the Midwest. And it wasn't actually him, technically, it was his new owner. Uh, Basically purchased him for the purpose of suing for his freedom. It's kind of bizarre, but that's how it worked. But Dred Scott, since he had been living in free land, he argued, or his new master argued, that he should be free. He should not be a citizen. So the Supreme Court delivered this opinion, and it wasn't even close. It was 7-2. So they said that a couple things. The first big point was any person, slave or free, who was descended from Africans was not a citizen. So no matter who you were, if you had African blood, then you were not considered a citizen. The second thing was slaves were private property, which means that Congress cannot take your property without due process. That goes back to the Constitution. But the reason they said that was it pretty much says that any efforts by the federal government, the national government, to limit slavery are unconstitutional. The federal government should not be able, Congress should not be able to restrict slavery because it's unconstitutional to take people's property. And then finally, even though states could pass laws to limit slavery, the federal government could not. And this is a big deal because it pretty much says that Congress should not be in the business of doing anything with slavery. And that really makes the South excited. They're emboldened. They believe that slavery is going to spread across the country now, and they will never have to worry about anything again. And in the North, this is like doomsday. Mostly because of the threats of the free labor system, not so much because they're worried about African American rights, but they still are upset about this possible expansion of slavery. So those are the big issues that you have going up into 1857. And then I'm going to do a couple more, but I'm going to stop here to break this into two parts because I'm probably going to run out of time. All right. So check it out.